From New York, this is Democracy Now!
I do think the fall and the winter of 2020 and 2021 are going to be probably one of the most difficult times that we've experienced in American public health.
As the U.S. reports its highest one-day spike in infections, and 11 states report record hospitalizations, the head of the Centers for Disease Control issues a dire prediction. Now the Trump administration is demanding states stop sending COVID patient data to the CDC, which then releases it to the public. We'll get response from Dr. Ali Khan, epidemiologist and dean of the College of Public Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. He's the former director of the CDC's Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response, where he oversaw the Strategic National Stockpile. We'll ask him about the ongoing shortages of masks and tests. Then Ohio State professor Amna Akbar says the left is remaking the world.
We are living in the era of Trump and the wall, the insurgence of white supremacy and right-wing movements. But we are also living in an age of protest and organizing and striking from the bottom and the left. Black Lives Matter and the indigenous Red Nation and Mi Gente and critical resistance. The nurses and the teachers, the tenants and the Amazon warehouse staff, the drivers at Uber and Lyft.
And as COVID-19 cases soar in the U.S. South and Southwest, we go to the hotspot of Arizona. 88% of the state's ICU beds are full. The family of one man accuses Arizona Governor Ducey and President Trump of being directly responsible for his death.
Governor Ducey's got blood on his hands. He was late to close down the state. He was early to open it. And the manner in which he opened, allowing things to go back as normal, is, in my opinion, the reason why my dad is being buried today.
We'll speak with Tucson Mayor Regina Romero. She's the first Latina and the first woman to be elected mayor of Tucson, and the daughter of migrant farm workers. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States has set another grim record for coronavirus infections, with more than 67,000 new cases confirmed Tuesday. At least 11 states are reporting record hospitalizations, with nearly 1,000 new deaths in just 24 hours. Officials in Texas and Arizona have put out calls for refrigerated trucks as morgues overflow with the bodies of COVID-19 patients. At least 136,000 people in the U.S. have now died from the disease. On Tuesday, the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Dr. Robert Redfield, made a dire prediction about the U.S. epidemic, which is already the worst in the world.
I do think the fall and the winter of 2020 and 2021 are going to be probably one of the most difficult times that we've experienced in American public health.
The CDC director's warning came as the Trump administration ordered U.S. hospitals to reroute where they usually send data on COVID-19 patients. Starting today, instead of the usual process of sending the data to the CDC, which then releases it to the public, states have been told to send it directly to the Department of Health and Human Services, that the New York Times reports is, quote, not open to the public, which could affect the work of scores of researchers, modelers, and health officials who rely on CDC data to make projections and crucial decisions. Meanwhile, four former heads of the CDC blasted President Trump's handling of the pandemic in a Washington Post op-ed, writing, quote, willful disregard for public health guidelines is unsurprisingly leading to a sharp rise in infections and deaths. America now stands as a global outlier in the coronavirus pandemic, the former CDC directors wrote. While White House officials said Tuesday the Republican National Convention may convene in an outdoor venue next month in Jacksonville as Florida grapples with an explosion of coronavirus cases. Florida reported a record 132 new deaths Tuesday, 2 days after its daily confirmed coronavirus caseload topped all of Europe combined. At least 6 Republican senators, including Florida's Senator Marco Rubio, have said they will not attend this year's RNC. And the mayor of Jacksonville, where the RNC is to take place, is now in self-quarantine. At the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned Tuesday the pandemic has spawned the sharpest decline in global per capita income in more than a century and could set the world economy back by decades. In South Africa, health officials have reimposed some lockdown measures, including a ban on alcohol sales amidst an exponential rise in COVID-19 cases. In India, nearly a dozen states have reimposed partial lockdowns as confirmed coronavirus cases rapidly approach 1 million. Brazil's death toll has topped 74,000, second only to the United States, with nearly 2 million confirmed cases. On Tuesday, protesters descended on the capital, Brasilia, demanding far-right President Jair Bolsonaro step down.
Brazil
can't take it anymore. There have been more than 70,000 deaths, more than 70,000 families crying over the deaths of people that were ignored and scorned by the genocidal person in charge of the Brazilian government.
President Bolsonaro has COVID-19. In Europe, the governments of both the UK and France are taking steps to mandate face masks in indoor public spaces. Germany, Greece, Italy, and Spain already have national mask mandates. In immigration news, the Trump administration's backed down on its plan to deport thousands of international students enrolled at universities that will offer online-only courses in the fall due to the coronavirus pandemic. The plan, announced by ICE, that's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, just last week, would have revoked visas for international students unless they transferred to universities holding in-person instruction. In Alabama, Jeff Sessions has failed in his bid to reclaim the U.S. Senate seat he vacated to become Attorney General before Trump fired him in 2018. Trump-backed candidate Tommy Tuberville, the former head coach of the Auburn football team, won Tuesday's Republican primary and will take in Democratic incumbent Senator Doug Jones in the general election. In Maine, Sarah Gideon, the Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, has won the Democratic nomination to take on Republican U.S. Senator Susan Collins in November. The race is on track to become the most expensive in Maine's history. In Texas, former Air Force helicopter pilot M.J. Hagar has narrowly defeated state lawmaker Royce West for the Democratic Party's nomination for a U.S. Senate seat. Hagar will challenge Republican incumbent Senator John Cornyn in November. Meanwhile, in Travis County, Texas, incumbent District Attorney Margaret Moore has conceded Tuesday's Democratic primary runoff to progressive challenger Jose Garza. Garza tweeted in response, quote, "Together we will transform our broken justice system and create a future where the dignity of communities of color is honored, immigrants and working families are protected, survivors are treated with respect, and the powerful are held accountable," he said. Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden has unveiled an economic recovery plan that would see $2 trillion invested in clean energy projects over 4 years. Biden's plan calls for new infrastructure projects, investments in electric cars and zero-emissions public transportation, an end to carbon pollution in U.S. power generation by 2035, a new civilian climate corps, and more. Biden laid out his plan in a speech in Delaware Tuesday.
When Donald Trump thinks about climate change, the only word he can muster is hoax. When I think about climate change, the word I think of is jobs.
Biden's plan drew measured praise from the Sunrise Movement, the youth-led climate action group that's pushing for the Green New Deal. The group tweeted, quote, "This plan isn't perfect and there are still gaps and places to push, but it's a major step forward and parts are more ambitious than what Bernie Sanders ran on in 2016 or Jay Inslee championed in 2020, Sunrise Movement said. In labor news, major U.S. retailers have quietly entered hazard pay for essential workers, even as the U.S. coronavirus epidemic reaches new heights. Amazon, Albertsons, Kroger, and Stop & Shop have all ended so-called hero pay, even as many workers have seen their risk of infection rise. In Joliet, Illinois, more than 700 unionized nurses at St. Joseph's Medical Center are in second week of a strike demanding safe staffing levels amidst the pandemic. The nurses say their demands for better nurse-to-patient ratios have been met with illegal intimidation and threats of termination by management. China is vowing to retaliate after President Trump Tuesday ordered an end to preferential trade treatment for Hong Kong while signing a bill authorizing new sanctions against Chinese officials who imposed an authoritarian security law on the semi-autonomous territory. It's the latest in a series of tit-for-tat moves that have brought U.S.-China relations to their lowest point in decades. On Monday, China imposed largely symbolic sanctions on senior U.S. politicians, including Republican Senators Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, in retaliation for U.S. sanctions over China's human rights abuses of minority Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province. In Jerusalem, thousands of Israelis protested outside the home of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu Tuesday, demanding he step down during his trial on corruption charges. Netanyahu is also under fire over his handling of the coronavirus pandemic amidst a spike of infections linked to the reopening of schools in May. At least one person was injured after police used horses and water cannons to disperse Tuesday's demonstrations. 50 protesters were arrested. In Honduras, 29-year-old environmentalist and land defender Marvin Damian Castro was found dead Monday near the capital of Tegucigalpa after going missing Sunday. Castro was a member of a network of land and water defenders in southern Honduras. He'd recently told a government human rights agency he was afraid for his life. 2 alleged gang members were arrested as suspects in Castro's killing. Violence against land and water defenders and indigenous leaders in Honduras has skyrocketed since the U.S.-backed coup in 2009. In Belarus, police arrested dozens of people in the capital Minsk Tuesday as they protested the Central Election Commission's refusal to allow opposition candidates to run against the authoritarian president Alexander Lukashenko. The decision solidifies Lukashenko's 26-year grip on power. A warning to our audience, this headline contains disturbing sounds and images of police violence. In Phoenix, Arizona, newly released body camera footage shows a police officer assaulting a 23-year-old unarmed woman after she was pulled over for a minor traffic violation in January. The video shows Officer Michael McGillis stopping Mariah Valenzuela without explanation before he suddenly tackles her and slams her to the ground without warning.
Is this your car?
No.
Bravo John Sam 5455. Do you have ID on you?
No. Why am I getting pulled over?
Put your hands behind your back.
Excuse me!
Put your hands behind your back!
No!
Put your hands behind your back! Stop! 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 Hands behind your back!
The assault left Valenzuela with injuries to her head, face, hands, and legs. The video surfaced just a week after another Phoenix police officer was caught on camera fatally shooting James Porter Garcia while he was in a parked car in a residential driveway over the 4th of July weekend. President Trump reacted angrily Tuesday to a question about police killings of African Americans. Trump was speaking with CBS News correspondent Catherine Herridge at the White House.
You said George Floyd's death was a terrible thing.
Terrible.
Why are African Americans still dying at the hands of law enforcement in this country?
And so are white people. So are white people. What a terrible question to ask. So are white people. More white people, by the way. More white people.
A recent Harvard University study found African Americans are more than 3 times as likely to be killed by police as white Americans. Meanwhile, President Trump again defended displays of the Confederate flag at NASCAR races and other events, calling it a free speech issue. And in a separate interview, Trump defended a wealthy white couple who pointed guns at Black Lives Matter protesters passing their home in a gated community in St. Louis last month. In Michigan, ProPublica reports a 15-year-old black student with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder has been jailed at a juvenile detention center in Detroit since May after a judge ruled she violated probation by failing to complete her high school coursework online. The teen has since been transferred to a long-term treatment program where she'll remain at least until a hearing review in September. Her jailing comes amidst demands for the release of juvenile prisoners at risk of coronavirus inside crowded detention centers. Here in New York, Ghislaine Maxwell, a British socialite who's accused of luring girls to be sexually abused by convicted predator and sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein, has pleaded not guilty to sex trafficking charges and will remain behind bars until her trial next year in July of 2021. A judge denied Maxwell bail Tuesday after two of Epstein's accusers pleaded for her to remain behind bars, and federal prosecutors argued she was an extreme flight risk. Maxwell's being held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, where her attorneys say she's at risk of contracting the coronavirus. She was arrested July 2nd, faces up to 35 years in prison if convicted. And Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was hospitalized again Tuesday after experiencing fever and chills linked to a possible infection. In May, the 87-year-old Supreme Court justice received a non-surgical treatment for a gallbladder condition. In 2018, she had surgery for lung cancer after previously beating pancreatic and colorectal cancer. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I am Amy Goodman in New York. Juan Gonzalez is broadcasting from his home in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, we're moving in on records being set every day. Coronavirus cases worldwide have soared by more than 1 million in just 5 days. The World Health Organization is warning the pandemic is raging out of control in North and South America, and that outbreak will continue to worsen if governments don't take basic public health precautions.
If the basics aren't followed, there is only one way this pandemic is going to go. It's going to get worse and worse and worse.
Here in the United States, more than 67,000 new cases of the coronavirus were reported Tuesday alone, marking the highest one-day spike so far. And at least 11 states reported record hospitalizations. More than 136,000 people in the country have now died from the disease. During a webinar with the journal The American Medical Association, the director of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Dr. Robert Redfield, made a dire prediction.
I do think the fall and the winter of 2020 and 2021 are going to be probably one of the most difficult times that we've experienced in American public health.
This comes as the Trump administration has ordered hospitals to bypass the Centers of Disease Control when they send COVID-19 patient data. Starting today, instead of the usual process of sending the data to the CDC, which then releases it to the public, states have been told to send it directly to a Department of Health and Human Services system that the New York Times reports is, quote, not open to the public, which could affect the work of scores of researchers, modelers, and health officials who rely on CDC data to make projections and crucial decisions. For more, we're joined by Dr. Ali Khan, epidemiologist and dean of the College of Public Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. He's the former director of the Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response at the CDC. He's also author, with William Patrick, of The Next Pandemic, On the Front Lines Against Humankind's Gravest Dangers, a book that looks at how the world's public health community responded to outbreaks of the most dangerous infectious diseases over the past quarter of a century. Dr. Khan, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Let's start with that new directive that no longer are hospitals to send their information on COVID-19 patient data to the CDC, but instead to bypass the CDC. Can you talk about the significance of this?
Good morning, Amy, and thank you for the opportunity. I think that story is a little bit more nuanced. So the type of data that's going to the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response is capacity and utilization data in terms of how many hospital beds are being used, how many ICU beds are being used. And that data has always traditionally gone to ASPR and not gone to CDC. What we're not seeing is that public health data is being rerouted to CDC, rerouted from CDC. So that story about where that specific bit of data is going may be a little bit nuanced because it's always gone to the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response in the past.
But the stuff that's being bypassed from the CDC, the significance of the public not then being able to see it?
Now, that would be an issue if the data is no longer available to the public. If you read the original memo, which I did, this was all about streamlining data to a single capacity data and utilization data. So how many hospital beds are being used, how many tests are being performed in hospitals to one site, so that multiple federal agencies are not asking hospitals for the exact same thing. This is what hospitals have asked for. They do not want to send data to multiple federal agencies. They want to send it to one place that is then shared everywhere else. So as long as the real test is this data still available to the American public is the real test.
Dr. Khan, there have been some issues or some criticisms about the CDC data in terms of the fact that there's always at least a week lag time between the time that the agency gets the information and the time it's released. Do you have concerns, given the fast-moving nature of this pandemic, that there is a need for the CDC to be able to make data available more quickly?
Oh, absolutely. This has been an issue from day one of this outbreak, which is a timely data and transparency of data. Countries that have managed this outbreak well, South Korea, for example, Singapore, all of their data is completely available to the public, and they're very timely in getting that data, and they use good metrics for how their response is going, and the U.S. has never adopted that strategy to the current day.
And speaking about other countries, what's your concern about the U.S. response to the pandemic compared to some other countries like South Korea or New Zealand?
That's an excellent question. So this, without a doubt, is the greatest public health failure in our nation's history, and it just continues to be in free fall. So we peaked at about 30,000 cases in mid-April, and then we squandered 2 months of lockdown and economic collapse by failing to get our disease contained, and now we're up to 60,000 cases a day. I mean, that's completely out of step with the rest of Europe, with Oceania and East Asia. So all those countries have not only just contained their outbreaks, resumed their economy, started back schools, but some countries have just gone all out and said, we're going to zero. So New Zealand has eliminated disease, right? A number of other countries have eliminated disease. China, with 1.4 billion people, has gone 9 days without a domestic case. So China is going for elimination too. So we are clearly the outlier with this uncontrolled response here in the United States, failed response here in the United States.
Dr. Ali Khan, what is the U.S. doing wrong?
So it goes right back. So, in the early days, I said it was lack of imagination. So, the U.S. had sort of been sucker punched by this outbreak. But at this point, it's very clear we don't have a national strategy based on the 4 principles that everybody else has used to get rid of this outbreak. Simple 4 principles, right? So the first principle to contain this outbreak is leadership. So that's integrated whole of government leadership from the local, state to national level. We still don't have that. We can't agree on so many things that are important. The second part is get down community transmission. And this is the role of government to make sure we're testing and tracing. Nobody's talking about that anymore. Isolating cases, quickly finding those contacts, nor does anybody talk about the metrics around that. The third thing is community engagement, and that's our role, right? Wear a mask. Please wear a mask. Wash your hands, social distance. And the fourth thing is do what you can to make sure that people who are hospitalized are more likely to survive. And the one drug we know that does that right now is dexamethasone. So those are 4 simple principles, a national strategy, 4 principles. We can get our disease contained like so many other countries all over the world.
Dr. Khan, you're the former head of the CDC's Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response, which included overseeing the Strategic National Stockpile on emergency medical supplies. Can you account for, many months into this pandemic, the United States continuing to have a shortage of tests and masks?
I have no explanation for that. I have said I could have grown polypropylene trees by this time for nasal swabs, given the ingenuity of Americans and our biomedical complex to create these materials, personal protective equipment to contain tests make tests. So I really have no explanation for that. I can say, though, that we have enough testing in the United States currently if we used it correctly and we got a timely result back and didn't have to wait a week for the results. So really, this goes back to strategy. We do not have the right strategy in the United States to get this disease contained. And if we did, we wouldn't be worried about personal protective equipment, right? South Korea today had 40 cases. Right? They're not worried about personal protective equipment. So we're worried about these things because we can't contain the disease and not willing to do the hard things, not willing to strip politics out of this, base it on the science, and get this disease under control.
And Dr. Khan, I wanted to ask you about the role of Anthony Fauci in terms of the handling of this disease, because on the one hand, we see the reality that the Trump administration is trying to undermine his credibility these days as he increasingly comes into conflict with what the president wants to do. But on the other hand, there are some legitimate questions. And in the early parts of the pandemic, Dr. Fauci did urge people not to wear masks. Now, he didn't couch it by saying there's a shortage. But at that time, most people in Asian countries were wearing masks, widespread use among the population. Your assessment of how Dr. Fauci has handled the crisis?
So really, this isn't about Dr. Fauci, right? This is about CDC, which is our nation's public health agency. And we need to see our nation's public health agency get their role back to educate the American people, to provide the necessary data and get us back into containment. And there's no doubt that there were missteps made by our public health agencies and public health professionals. Masks is a good example. The lack of a strategy that couldn't tell the difference between flu and a SARS virus, the lack of testing. So there were a lot of missteps. However, what we need now is we need that talent we've always had at CDC back at the forefront talking about public health issues. That's where our public health expertise resides. It resides at CDC, not at the NIH, not at ASPR, not at whatever. It resides at CDC. We need to hear CDC's voice, bring those wonderful, amazing people, the greatest public health agency in the world, back to the forefront and help us contain this disease.
And how optimistic are you about the development of a vaccine?
I am optimistic. However, the road to an uncertain vaccine is paved in death. Right. So we talk about 60,000 cases a day. So that's basically we're minting 600 to 1,000 new death certificates every day. Right. We can't wait for a vaccine. Right. And other countries have gotten their diseases contained and eliminated without a vaccine. So, yes, I would love a vaccine. There's lots of data that makes it problematic. Immunity may be short-lived. We've never had vaccines based on these technologies. So I'm as anybody else, I'm optimistic. I hope there's a vaccine. We don't need a vaccine today so that we don't kill another 600 to 1,000 people tomorrow. We have the tools.
Can you talk, Dr. Ali Khan, about what it would mean if the President of the United States simply put on a mask on a regular basis? Trump seeing a mask as weakness. Only this past weekend, you saw him for a minute wearing a mask, and he said, well, he was in a hospital. The significance of what this would mean at the federal level, then you see it go down to the state level. His biggest allies, DeSantis, the governor of Florida, for the first time donning a mask. In Arizona, we're going to go to and speak with the mayor of Tucson today. Governor Ducey, a recent death in Arizona of a Mexican-American man. His daughter said, I say that the governor and the president have blood on their hands. Do you feel the same way, Dr. Khan?
I believe all of government has blood on their hands. 136,000 deaths, preventable deaths, a tragedy. There's a lot of blood to go around here, Amy. Let's be very honest. If you look at the rest of the world that's contained their disease and some even eliminated. So there's a lot of blood to go around. But what you saw in countries that was successful was that each and every politician, regardless of their party, followed the science. So everybody said, wear masks. No controversy. Everybody wore a mask. They got their disease under control. And we need to see that again right now at every political level, local, national, local, state, national. Wear a mask. That's one of the 4 strategies that will get us out of this mess. So we need everybody to be wearing a mask at this point.
Let me ask you about some of the recent studies out of China, Germany, and Britain suggesting that people who've had COVID-19 begin losing their antibodies in just a few months. So even if there was a vaccine, the significance of this, Dr. Khan, and also of the younger people that we're seeing get sick and die all over the country.
So, Amy, two great questions. So, yes, if your immunity is short-lived, that makes this finding a vaccine, we're chasing rainbows, right? So, again, a reminder, we don't need a vaccine to get out of this mess. Even today, I'm very hopeful. Public health still works today the way it worked at the end of January. We can get this outbreak under control. As far as young people are involved, without a doubt, we see less severe disease. However, young people also can get sick, right? They can also get hospitalized. They also die. We are now learning that about 50% of all people who get infected with this disease have some sort of heart abnormality. So even if you don't die, there are long-term complications of this disease. So we don't want our young people to get infected either.
And Dr. Khan, speaking of young people, your sense of how various states and school districts around the nation are handling the issue of the reopening of public schools. What's your assessment of because obviously, depending on where you are in the country, there's very different solutions, whether it's all remote or partial days of the week in the schools?
So I will be very honest to you. As a pediatrician, as a father, as a public health professional, we need kids back in school. Right, without a doubt. We need to get kids back in school for numerous reasons, but we have to get them back safely. And we know we can do this. You know, I just did a review of over 15 countries that were able to safely get kids back in school. But that's based on not just the safety measures we take and wearing masks and everything else that the kids need to do. It's based on dropping community transmission. So I say that unless you have approximately 25 cases per million population per day, you can't resume schools, right? So if people want to go back to schools, please put on your mask, right? Drop your community transmission. Work with the local health department. Make sure they have the support they need to test and trace everybody. You know, this is what we all need to do to get our kids back in school. Let's not put them at risk.
Dr. Ali Khan, we want to thank you for being with us, epidemiologist, dean of the College of Public Health at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, former director of the CDC's Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response, where he oversaw the Strategic National Stockpile. When we come back, we speak with Ohio State professor Amna Akbar, her new piece, The Left is Remaking the World. Then we'll speak with the mayor of Tucson. Stay with us.
Feel alright in the summertime, in the fall, in the spring, when the house is dark, doesn't bother me at all. I know, it's in the light, the shadows start to move, but there's a hurt in the winter time that makes it hard for you. There's a dream I had that makes me sad on the road.
Wintertime by Norah Jones, ongoing concert series called Live from the Living Room. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. As COVID-19 cases hit a new high and at least 11 states report record hospitalizations, we look at another looming crisis for the American public, mass evictions. We're now more than 4 months into a pandemic that's left millions unemployed. Eviction freezes across the country are ending, even as case numbers rise and states reimpose lockdown measures. Many warn a tidal wave of evictions and a spike in homelessness during the pandemic could be next. In Michigan, where a halt on evictions ends Thursday, the state estimates it's a backlog of 75,000 eviction filings. Other states have already resumed eviction hearings, including Texas, Georgia, Ohio, where a Columbus Convention Center has been converted into a massive socially distanced housing court. The COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project reports more than 20 million people could face eviction by the end of September, and those hardest hit will be Black and Latinx. This comes as the $600 a week bump for unemployment benefits that Congress passed as COVID relief measure is set to expire in a few weeks. Facing these dire circumstances, activists are continuing their demand to cancel the rent, a movement that's inspired rent strikes and protests nationwide. And a coalition of labor unions, workers, and racial and social justice groups in 25 states plan to stage a mass walkout this Monday called the Strike for Black Lives. For more, we're joined by Amna Akbar, law professor at Ohio State University, who wrote about how to respond to all of this in her op-ed in Sunday's New York Times headlined, "The Left is Remaking the World." Welcome to Democracy Now! Thank you for joining us from Columbus, Ohio. Professor Akbar, the beginning of your piece, you say that the uprisings in response to the killing of George Floyd are far different than anything that has come before. Please explain.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Juan. Well, the pandemic and the uprisings have raised fundamental questions about what the state does and does not, and for who has to work in what form and for what pay, and the interdependence of all of our lives. We have 18 million people unemployed in the country, and as you were saying, 20 million people face possible eviction and houselessness by the fall. And the response from Trump and Tim Cook recently was to tell Americans to find something new. We had the one-time $1,200 payout from the feds and various forms of closings of housing court, which are now coming to a close, as you mentioned. There has been a total lack of imagination and, more importantly, political will to respond to the basic human needs of people. And if this is not the purpose of our coming together and electing people to represent us, we should be asking some hard questions of what the purpose of the state is. But I want to take a moment to unpack cancel rent and defund the police, which are two really important demands that organizers and social movements are making across the country. Police and private property are central defining institutions of life in the United States. We know the centrality of police to local budgets now and the immense power that they have and their sprawling scale, because it has been on spectacular display for the last 2 months since Minneapolis police killed George Floyd. But it might be worth taking a moment to talk about private property, which is also everywhere and structures our everyday lives, but is arguably a bit more subterranean in how it does. Private property is the basis of our legal regime. It's a settler regime, a capitalist regime, a racial regime. It creates these relationships where some people own property and most people don't. And if you don't own property, you have to pay for it. This is pretty weird if you think about it. We are human. We have physical bodies. We need space to exist, to sleep, to eat, to take care of one another. But we live in a society where you need to pay for space to live. The private property regime then creates a direct contradiction with people meeting people's needs. And so both police and private property are rooted in the histories of enslavement and conquest. They are not systems rooted in collective care and social provision. And it's not as if we have the police over here and private property over there. These are fundamentally interconnected institutions that prop one another up. They are central to the stories, the structures, and the relationships that sustain things as they are. And so it might be helpful to think for a moment about the connection between these institutions, because part of what I argued in the piece is kind of this radical imagination coming out of today's social movements that's telling interwoven stories about the world that we live in and the world that we must build. So many police killings around the country have happened in gentrifying neighborhoods, including here in Columbus, where Columbus police killed Tyree King, Henry Green, and Julius Tate, young black men and boys in gentrifying neighborhoods. Police arrest people for stealing food to eat or selling loosies to survive or living under a bridge or squatting in a home when they have nowhere else to go. And all over the country, sheriff's offices work with landlords to evict people who can't pay their rents. And so contrary to this popular idea that we have the market over here and the state over there, we see that the state works to protect the more powerful players in the market by lending them untold volumes of arsenal. And of course, central to the defund demand is precisely this critique of neoliberalism, that the state has been stripped of virtually all of its provisioning function, which we see on spectacular display right now in response to COVID-19. We don't guarantee housing, we don't guarantee food, we don't guarantee health care or PPE. Instead, all of our tax dollars are going to prisons, police, and jails to sustain things as they are, enact so much violence on poor, working class, Black and brown people, and distract us from the real work of collective care and social provision. And so the pandemic and the uprising have put a magnifying glass on how the most powerful institutions in the most powerful country on earth have absolutely failed to meet the needs of the vast majority of Americans. We have a federalist system with layers of government, right? We have local, state, federal, and none of it guarantees any of the basics that we need to survive. We're always told it's too expensive and we can't afford it. But now we know that we spend hundreds of billions of dollars on building prisons, jails, and detention centers to house 2.3 million people in cages. We pay the salaries and benefits of 800,000 police around the country for their tanks and guns and horses and bikes, tasers and stingrays. And in that case, it's no surprise that the police responded so quickly and in such a coordinated fashion across the country in response to the protests, and the state completely failed to respond to COVID-19. And of course, on the other hand, the pandemic and the uprising have reminded us of our collective power and our collective resilience. We have the power to consent or refuse. We have the power to build alternatives. So when today's movements and organizers are calling to cancel the rent or defund the police, these demands are calling for material changes to make a real impact in the daily lives of everyday people. And the demands in themselves are throwing into crisis the very shape of the state today, because they ask the state to step in on behalf of people over property and people over police. And we live in a society where both of those institutions, private property and policing, take precedent over the lives of working class people.
Professor Akbar, I wanted to ask you, though, what is singular about this movement compared to movements in the past that also believed that they were remaking the world? I'm speaking, for instance, of the anarchists, the Magonistas in Mexico, the International Workers of the World in the early 1900s, the communist and social movements in the 1930s, right after in the wake of the Great Depression, the New Left movement of the 1960s, which I was a part of. Our slogan then was not defund the police; it was off the pigs, and yet each of these movements thought that they were going to remake the world. However, capitalism proved to be a lot more resilient in its ability to co-opt and to adjust to the threats. I'm wondering how you think that this is going to be any different. And also, are you taking into account the potential for a fascist or right-wing response to the current movement?
Thanks, Juan. So we are about a decade into sustained social movement activity in the United States. If you think back to Occupy focused our attention on capitalism and income inequality through an exercise of prefigurative politics through the encampments that we saw all around the world. And then through Ferguson and Baltimore, Black Lives Matter and more, all of those kind of protest moments made us confront the long history of anti-Black violence in the United States. Standing Rock made center stage indigenous struggle and how the state and powerful corporations work together to take from the land in blatant violation of treaty rights, connecting indigenous resistance to environmental justice and environmental degradation to capitalism. And now with Defund Police, we have a new call, kind of a new moment where left social movements, young people of color, are calling for these various modes of reforms that are designed to imagine and start to build a different kind of world. And now, and then the moments I just named are kind of the spectacular headline moments, the moments of the whirlwind. And all the while, long before and long after, you have the slow work of organizing. So you have base building, political education, toolkits, campaigns, coalition building, and canvassing. And so in the last decade, we have built our power and our analysis, expanded our collective muscle for a wide array of strategies and tactics, and built all sorts of institutions, organizations, coalitions, magazines, podcasts, bail funds, mutual aid networks, and more. And so while there are certainly differences in analysis and theories of change across the left, and working class organizing. There's also a growing overlap with more and more people understanding why the status quo can't stand, how the status quo is a product of a global and local history, and the need to come together to build alternatives. And so whether this is a more powerful formation or powerful moment than any other one across the, in the history of the United States or around the world, that I don't know. But I do know that over the course of my life, this is certainly the strongest the left and working class movements have been. And I feel hopeful about where we are. And of course, I feel apprehensive because our opponents are not going to pack up and go home, as Rachel Hertzing put it the other day when I was talking to her. We are going to see, and we are seeing, state repression all over the country, whether it's federal prosecutions of protesters or all sorts of local and state prosecutions, and not to mention the ongoing criminalization and prosecution of working class people for their survival. And so the odds against us are long, but we are also stronger than we have been over the last few decades.
Well, Amna Akbar, we will certainly continue to cover all of these issues, and we hope to get back to you soon. Professor Akbar teaches at Ohio State University. We'll link to your column in the New York Times headlined, "The Left is Remaking the World." When we come back, we'll be joined by the mayor of Tucson, Arizona, yet another hot spot in the United States. Stay with us. Music by Tucson cumbia band Vox Urbana. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. This is the Quarantine Report. As COVID-19 cases soar in the southern and southwest United States, we go to the hotspot of Arizona, which reported more than 128,000 infections Tuesday. Nearly 90% of Arizona's ICU beds are full. Republican Governor Doug Ducey faces widespread outrage for downplaying the virus and even obstructing local officials from acquiring masks in June as case numbers began to explode. Ducey has reversed course and allowed mayors to issue their own virus guidelines under growing pressure, but he resisted calls to pass a statewide mask mandate or reimpose his stay-at-home order, which expired in May with little restriction on the state's reopening. Facing rising numbers in June, Ducey ordered bars and gyms to close again. But Arizona residents say the actions are too little too late. The family of a 65-year-old Mexican-American man who died of COVID-19 in Phoenix is accusing Arizona state officials of being directly responsible for his death. In a scathing obituary in the Arizona Republic, the family of Mark Anthony Urquiza wrote, quote, "His death is due to the carelessness of the politicians who continue to jeopardize the health of brown bodies through a clear lack of leadership, refusal to acknowledge the severity of the crisis, and inability and unwillingness to give clear and decisive direction on how to minimize risk." This is Urquiza's daughter, Kristen, at an interview with the Arizona Republic.
Governor Ducey's got blood on his hands. He was late to close down the state. He was early to open it. And the manner in which he opened, allowing things to go back as normal, is, in my opinion, the reason why my dad is being buried today.
Well, for more, we're going to Tucson to speak with a local leader who's been standing up to Governor Doug Ducey. That's Mayor Regina Romero. She is the first Latina and the first woman to be elected mayor of Tucson. She was previously a Tucson City Council member for over a decade, the daughter of migrant workers. We welcome you to Democracy Now!, Mayor Romero. Your thoughts on Governor Ducey's responsibility? What do you want to see the state of Arizona do, and what are you doing in Tucson?
Good morning, Amy and Juan. Thank you so much for having me this morning. We have been in a state of crisis since Governor Ducey decided to hastily reopen the state. We were in a very good place, coming to a plateau. Here in the city of Tucson, we're located in Pima County. In Pima County, we were seeing 24 cases a day. It was a plateau. Now we are seeing almost 300 cases a day in Pima County. In a county of 1 million people, we see anywhere from 5 to 20 ICU beds, which is very, very concerning and straining our doctors and nurses at our hospitals. We jumped up in front of Governor Ducey, a few mayors, Mayor Gallego from Phoenix, Mayor Evans from Flagstaff, and myself jumped ahead of the governor to call the stay-at-home orders and to close down bars back in March. He took our cue a few days later, and with his executive order, he tied the hands of mayors in cities and towns and county health departments throughout the state by preempting us from doing anything that he wouldn't do. Most recently, he untied the hands of mayors and counties throughout the state to do mandatory mask ordinances throughout the state. But what we have been seeing with Governor Ducey is a microcosm of what has been happening with Trump in his federal response to this pandemic, which is a tepid response, a pushback on science and what public health officials recommend that we do. Every day that Governor Ducey waits, we see 3,000 cases in Arizona, and the crisis continues. More lives lost. And so what we have been doing here in Tucson is basically pushing the governor to do the right thing, because it's a very real threat. If we do move ahead in front of him, the state legislature, the Republican-controlled state legislature, passed a bill about 3 years ago, 1487, that if any city does anything, any law that preempts the state, that our state shared revenue could be pulled from us. And those are millions and millions of dollars that we could potentially lose. And so in this crisis, we see ourselves as mayors in fear for the lives of our communities, in fear for the inability for us to be able to do anything. So what mayors across Arizona and I have been doing is publicly pressuring the governor to do the right thing. The one thing that he could do that could help is institute a mandatory mask executive order statewide, and he refuses to even do that.
Mayor Romero, what's the testing situation in Tucson and Pima County? Are people able to get testing? How long does it take to get the results back? And what kind of contact tracing is going on?
The Pima County Health Department has been providing testing to the community. It has been very, very little. And even Pima County Health Department says that we need much more. We do not see the help of the governor from the state or of the federal government. In Maricopa County, the mayor, Kate Gallego, had to pressure publicly the governor and FEMA, the federal government, to institute additional testing sites. Here in Pima County, we have none. We have no state or federal help. I know that the governor has been working with nonprofit healthcare providers in terms of testing here in Pima County, and Pima County Health Department has been providing it, but we need much more. We need federal help so that we could test. The two things that we need to do, according to health officials, is testing and contact tracing, and then isolation opportunities for those that are positive. And so we don't have enough federal help. Governor Ducey has not communicated with me or Mayor Gallego from Phoenix, the two biggest cities in Arizona. And so we really are in the dark as to what type of help we can get here in Pima County, in the city of Tucson, and throughout the state. It is really concerning that even in terms of communicating with us, there's absence there, and there's unwillingness
I wanted to ask you about the situation with housing. As many as 74,000 Pima County residents could be at risk of losing their homes because the moratorium on evictions that Governor Ducey had put into place expires next week, July 22nd. What can you do if that is not extended? And what is the situation, potential homelessness occurring in your city?
What mayor and council here in the city of Tucson did was use some of those federal CARES Act monies to put into rental and utility assistance. We used $5 million of the $95 million that we received to help families with rent assistance, but we're going to need more. And so one of the issues that I've asked Governor Ducey to consider is that he extend that moratorium till the end, at least till the end of the year, so that we don't see families losing their home and therefore aggravate the issue of the virus of COVID-19 spreading throughout Arizona even worse. And so here in Tucson, we're dedicating CARES Act funds to help families. And I'm asking the governor to extend his moratorium so that it is a statewide moratorium to help families statewide. Because if families lose their homes in a border town like Nogales, they will travel to Tucson. And so we will see people traveling from town to town to try and find help. And we will see that continued spread of COVID-19.
Mayor, do you agree that Governor Ducey has blood on his hands, as the daughter of the Mexican-American COVID victim expressed?
I believe that every single day that Governor Ducey waits and does nothing, we see additional deaths in our state. We see additional people, 3,000 people a day here in Arizona. And so it is unconscionable for Governor Ducey to sit and not act. And right now, at this point, we need the leader of our state to do statewide action, institute statewide action. One of the easiest steps that he can take is institute a mandatory face covering throughout the state. He can, and the mayors have told them that we will support him if he decides to recall his stay-at-home order, that we will stand behind him. It is a point of crisis right now in the state of Arizona. We're not only a hotspot in the nation, we're a hotspot in the world. So we need him to take a swift action so that we can bend this curve downwards and then move forward together.
And finally, the link you see between what's happened with COVID-19, the effect on Black and brown populations, and also the issue of police brutality. You hung a Black Lives Matter banner on Tucson City Hall. We just have, 20 seconds.
We are seeing Mexican Americans, brown and black, and Native American folk here in Arizona received the biggest brunt of this disease, and so that points to issues in healthcare in not just Arizona, but our country. And so we see the brunt of COVID-19 here in Arizona. It points to inequities in healthcare delivery to people of color. And we have to, for me, it's important that we state the truth, right?
We have to leave it there. Mayor Romero, we thank you so much for being with us. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.